Sure. What does this say? Okay, now it's on. All right. Let's get started. Oh, here's another Melissa. Hey, Melissa.
Hello. Long time no see.
Yes. No company this weekend?
Not this weekend. This weekend, I did something that you guys would have loved. My friends and I rented an Airbnb on the river, and we had a book lovers weekend where we
Oh,
just
how.
flopped around the house all day and read and worked and crocheted and painted and played games and ate food. It was very enjoyable.
Oh, that sounds like so much fun.
It was very fun, but now I'm very tired because I had to get up
Yes.
early this morning to go to church. But it was I took a 3-hour nap this afternoon. So it was worth it.
Yeah, something about being in a house with a bunch of friends isn't conducive to
No, we stayed up
going
way
to
too
bed
late.
at night.
The only downside was there was a train track right behind the house. And so a very loud train went through multiple times in the middle of the night and scared me half to death. And I was wondering why there was these jars of earplugs everywhere, and that is why.
That's funny. It was funny when I went to Maranatha, they have those train
Oh, right,
tracks.
right.
I grew up next to train tracks.
Oh, uh-huh.
Didn't faze me a bit. All the other people in the dorms were complaining about the trains and how loud they were. I'm like, trains? No big deal. Don't even notice them.
Yep. Yep.
All
Yeah.
right. So where along the river were you?
In Princeton, Iowa, so past LeClaire. So it was only like 23 minutes from home, so it wasn't far.
Oh, that's not bad.
No.
Still sounds fun.
Yes, it was.
All right. So we're on to the end of Philippians chapter 2 tonight, looking at the last 6 verses. Paul says, "Yet I supposed it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and companion in labor, and fellow soldier, but your messenger, and he that ministered to my wants. For he longed after you all, and was full of heaviness, because that ye had heard that he had been sick. For indeed he was sick, nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I sent him therefore the more carefully, that when ye see him again ye may rejoice, and that I may be the less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation, because for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death, not regarding his life, to supply your lack of service toward me." Um, before we go any farther, how many of you have the book? One, two? Okay. Did you read the chapter? Okay. That's fine. Doesn't matter. I think you'll get it all anyhow. I was just curious because I'm not sure I agree with the author on a couple of his ideas or thoughts. Anyhow, way back 4 or 5 weeks ago in principle number 7, where we talked about elevating one another above yourself, Paul gave 4 examples of people who modeled biblical humility. Of course, he first talked about Jesus Christ, where, let's see, it was, he humbled him. He thought it not robbery to be equal with God, made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant. He humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. And then and then Paul used himself as the second example. Then last week we talked about Timothy and how Paul praised Timothy and talked about how he put other people first. And so tonight we come to the last of those four, and that is a friend of Paul's named Epaphroditus. So who was Epaphroditus? Well, where is it? Verse 25, he gives us a description of Epaphroditus. Paul said he is a brother, not a blood brother. Very possibly he was not even Jewish. His name seems to indicate that he was likely Greek, but he was a brother in Christ, a fellow believer. And then it goes on to talk about Epaphroditus being a companion in labor, meaning in the work of the gospel, working with Paul and at other times in other places, working for the spread of the gospel. Paul describes Epaphroditus as being a fellow soldier, not in the sense of being like in the Roman army or anything, but a fellow soldier in spiritual warfare, fighting against the world, the flesh, and the devil, fighting side by side with Paul for God's truth. And what passage, when we talk about spiritual warfare, what passages come to your mind?
First Timothy? Or is that the right one? No.
Maybe not, but I'd have to look it up. I don't have.
Can you repeat the question?
When we talk about
Can you repeat the question?
When we talk about spiritual warfare, what passages come to mind?
The armor of God, I guess.
Which is
Armor.
Can you think
The
of-
armor of God.
It's Ephesians something, right?
Yes, Ephesians 6.
Ephesians 6.
Is that what you were
Ephesians
thinking of, Karen?
Well, I was also thinking about
I know what you're thinking of.
fight not against
Yes.
fighting against the principalities and the powers of the world.
Well, that's
Right? Is that what I'm thinking of?
in Ephesians 6 verse
Being
12,
one
he says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places."
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking about.
Okay, but somewhere, probably in Timothy, I didn't think of this earlier, but I think Paul does write to Timothy and tell him something about fight the good fight or something like that. But I didn't look that up to verify. So, a brother, a companion in labor, a fellow soldier, a messenger, or you could call him an envoy. In Philippians 4:18, it tells us that Epaphroditus was sent from the church in Philippi to Rome, to Paul, bearing a gift from the church. Paul says, "But I have all and abound. I am full having received of Epaphroditus the things which were sent from you. So, Epaphroditus, among other things, was the envoy, or almost like a courier. You might, from when I was looking up these verses, some people have used the word apostle here because of the Greek word that was used, but not to be used the same way as that Paul was an apostle. Used as someone who was sent, like an envoy or a messenger. So the idea of Epaphroditus being an apostle, if you ever hear somebody claiming that, not an apostle like Paul or the 12 disciples, just someone sent. And Epaphroditus was sent to relieve, comfort, and assist Paul. Remember, Paul is under arrest. Probably he's in house arrest, which is a little bit better than being in the Roman prisons, but still quite confined. And Epaphroditus was also described as being a minister or a servant, serving Paul, performing duties to assist and support Paul, helping with Paul's personal needs, maybe running errands or finding supplies, and also assisting with ministry needs. So, Epaphroditus he didn't just bring the gift from Philippi and turn around and go home. No, he was hanging around, helping Paul, serving with Paul, working with Paul. Remember we said last week that from Philippi to Rome, the distance would take about 800 miles, would take about 80 days to make that journey. So that's not something you would do and turn around and go right back home. So, and then Epaphroditus got sick. What type of sickness? The Bible doesn't really specify. I think sickness during that time was probably quite common. Their hygiene standards were far less than what we know today. The author of the book thinks it might have been severe homesickness which led to depression. And my guess is he had his basis for that is in verse 26, where it says, "For he longed after you all and was full of heaviness." But if you continue that verse, it says, "Because that ye had heard that he had been sick." So I'm not sure that you can take it that way or not. I looked at a couple other translations that I had easy access to. And the ESV uses the phrase where it says, "He longed after you all." They use the phrase, "For he has been longing for you all." And the ASV said, "Since he longed after you all." So that might give some reason to think that he was suffering from homesickness, but I'm definitely not going to be dogmatic about that. But he did have a very, let's see, from the commentaries I looked at, one of them said he had a very vehement and longing desire after all of them. And that same commentator Tater went on to say that Epaphroditus was quite disheartened and dispirited, ready to sink and die away, not so much with his own disorder and illness, as with sorrow on account of the church at Philippi. And the Greek expresses that phrase as being worn out and overpowered with heavy grief. So his longing for the church in Philippi, the believers there at the church, could have been homesickness. It could have been just he was so worried about them being concerned about him because he was sick. So there was one interesting note in some of the comments I read about or relating to the idea that the apostolic gifts were continuous. And if that were so, then why didn't Paul just heal him if he had that spiritual gift? One of them said, Epaphroditus' sickness proves that the apostles had not ordinarily the permanent gift of miracles any more than of inspiration. Both were vouchsafed to them only for each particular occasion as the Spirit thought fit. And another one said that no intimation is given that the recovery of Epaphroditus was miraculous. It is plainly spoken of as a natural event. And there's another example of a similar situation towards the end of 2 Timothy. Paul's finishing his writing there, doing all his salutations and greet so-and-so and greet so-and-so, and this is what I've been doing. And he said in chapter 4, verse 20, Erastus abode at Corinth, but Trophimus have I left at Miletum sick. So again, if Paul had these miraculous powers always present, he could have just healed him and he wouldn't have to have left Trophimus sick and so on. So, just a thought and aside there. Could it have been homesickness and or severe depression? Could have been. But at the same time, we don't have biblical proof of that. Homesickness is real and it can be devastating. You have all in your past gone to camp, and at some point there was probably somebody in your cabin or somewhere that you heard of who was terribly homesick and could hardly function. Maybe they even had to send the child home. So it is a real thing. Most of us are able to work through that and get beyond it, but not everybody can. Severe depression is real, and the causes are not always clear. And sometimes, I'm afraid, in our circles, so to speak, I think sometimes that is made light of. Maybe not so much as it used to be, but there's this stigma around it that if you're a real follower of Christ, that should never happen to you. And I don't think that's the case, because if it because there are chemical imbalances involved. So, contrary to what some might believe, severe depression is a real issue. And as believers, we shouldn't mock or make less or light of a person's struggle with depression. Instead, we should love and support them. Of course, work with them on a spiritual basis, but at the same time understand that that may not be all that they need, and encourage them to get the help they need, whatever that may be. There were a couple of things that were in the news within the last week or two. One thing about antidepressants, about how they weren't doing what they thought they were doing, or they weren't working the way they thought they were. Anyhow, it's much more of a trial and error thing than most biological medicine type issues are. So, that verse 26, for he longed after you all, and was full of heaviness, because that ye had heard that he had been sick. What else might Epaphroditus have been worried about? He might have been embarrassed about being ill, whether that was a physical illness or a mental issue. He might have been feeling like he failed in his mission or failed his friends in Philippi. He was there supposed to be helping Paul, and he got sick and couldn't do what they were expecting him to do. And he might have been ashamed of having to return home, of having failed in his mission. So, what does the text tell us about the relationship between Paul and Epaphroditus? We already talked about how Paul viewed him, but Paul genuinely cared for Epaphroditus. He talked about how much sorrow he would face if Epaphroditus were to die. The verse 27, Paul says, for indeed he was sick, nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon the sorrow. And the phrase sorrow upon sorrow, or sorrow after sorrow, is like a compounding thing. An illustration might be like waves of the ocean, continuously coming, never stopping. Once when I was maybe 14 or 15, we took a trip to the East Coast. We had some friends from church who had moved out to New Jersey. We went to, we stopped in Philadelphia. We saw Gettysburg. We camped right by where Washington crossed the Delaware River. And then we went to stay for a couple days with our friends in New Jersey. And one of the things we were doing there was going on this fishing expedition in the ocean, on this boat, fishing boat on the ocean. It was not a large boat. I mean, yeah, it's bigger than, your average rowboat, but the waves that day were at least 12 feet high. The waves were bigger than the boat. We were all so sick, but the waves kept coming and coming. And when I was reading that, wave after wave, that was the first thing I thought of. was this miserable fishing expedition. In fact, the guy in charge or who owned the fishing boat, it was like a charter fishing boat or something that, it was more than just us and our friends on the boat. They almost didn't go out on that trip, and they weren't doing any other trips the rest of the day. So wave after wave of sorrows is what Paul was talking about. And Paul was willing to send him back to Philippi, even though it would mean Paul would be having less help and less support. But Paul was still willing because it was the right thing for him to do. And it wasn't just about what Epaphroditus did for Paul, but why he was doing it. Epaphroditus was serving Paul without any sense of getting something out of it for himself. And Paul, in allowing Epaphroditus to go home to Philippi, Paul was choosing against himself for someone else. He was willing to benefit Epaphroditus, even though it was going to be harder on himself. Paul compared Epaphroditus to Christ's model, making himself nothing and humbling himself in order to serve. And if I'm remembering correctly, and I just thought of this now and didn't go back and check on it, but I believe Epaphroditus was carrying this letter home to the believers there in the church in Philippi. Let's see. Paul was concerned about Epaphroditus' health and well-being. He was being careful about him. Verse 28, I sent him therefore the more carefully. And he asked the Philippian believers to rejoice in Epaphroditus' homecoming. We talked earlier about how Epaphroditus might have been feeling ashamed or like a failure that he couldn't continue serving with and for Paul. But Paul's asking the believers there in Philippi to be welcoming to him. Verse 29, receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness. Consider his reputation. Rejoice upon seeing him again. Why? Let's see. So why was Paul sending Epaphroditus back? Well, Epaphroditus longed to return to them. And secondly, Epaphroditus was worried that the Philippians were worried about him. Have you ever been in that situation? You're worried about somebody because they're worried about you. It's kind of an odd thing, but so Paul wanted the Philippians to receive him with joy, to be joyful at his homecoming. Paul wanted them to be supportive of Epaphroditus, to, how do I put this? Without any damage to his reputation. They didn't want them to think Paul didn't want them to think badly of Epaphroditus because he had to come home. And Paul explains that. Verse 30. He worked himself sick, because for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death. He was being so selfless and so self-centered that his health suffered as a result. He was doing the work that the other believers in Philippi were not able to do. We talked earlier about how he had to take that long journey to Rome and how long that would take. Most of the believers there in the church were not able to do that. They couldn't travel to Rome. They probably didn't have the monetary wherewithal to do that kind of journey. Definitely didn't have the time to do that kind of journey. He was, Epaphroditus was concerned with carrying the gift and the responsibility of carrying that gift from the church there to Paul. It was probably a monetary gift, although it might have been physical supplies. Epaphroditus was concerned for the work of Christ. He gave up his comforts to serve Paul on their behalf. A true example of self-sacrifice. So, the desired and expected result of Epaphroditus' return to Philippi, according to Paul, should be joy and gladness. Paul said that when ye see him again, ye may rejoice, that I may be the less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation. So rejoicing on the part of the Philippians, less sorrow and concern for Paul, because the Philippians would be happy to see him again. So that would mean Paul was less sad that he had gone home. And Paul's joy would be made more because of the rejoicing he expected from the Philippian believers. Isn't that kind of how it works? Or it should, when you hear somebody else's good news or something good about somebody else, it makes you feel good as well. Emily's joining us too. So, Paul's instructions to the Philippians were to welcome Epaphroditus home with great joy, and to rejoice in his homecoming, and to rejoice with him that he was able to come home. So, we see that Paul was doing right by Epaphroditus. That's the principle of this week. Do right by others. Paul was doing right by Epaphroditus, not demanding that he stay there and continue to work with Paul, but he's allowing Epaphroditus to go home to Philippi, even though it was at a cost to Paul. Paul was willing to give up support for himself and send Epaphroditus back to Philippi, which reminded me of a couple verses. Proverbs 3:27, I mentioned this verse last week also. Withhold not good from them to whom it is due, when it is in the power of thine hand to do it. And Galatians 6:10, as we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. So, doing good to others is putting others above ourselves, and it is also part of doing right by others. There was a quotation in the book, losing something for the sake of others has the profound effect of giving us back more, usually in the currency of inner joy and contentment. The concept there of giving being better than getting, or giving being better than receiving. The author used the classic literary example of Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, which I think you're all familiar with. But Scrooge goes through a great transformation from being a self-centered, selfish jerk to becoming a giving, going out of his way to give type of person. And it completely changed Scrooge's outlook. He became generous, he became joyful. He was far happier giving than he was in receiving. In the book, there was another quotation, when we do the right thing by other people, it not only increases their joy, but it also increases our joy at the same time in even greater measure. And if you think about the example of Scrooge, when he changed, when he started giving, I mean, how much joy did he receive from giving so Tiny Tim could have the medical care that he needed and continue to live and thrive? And that's kind of appropriate even for us to think or start thinking about now as we're coming to the holiday season. We give, but sometimes hiding deep inside us is always this kind of thing. What, am I going to get anything? But no, our joy should be in the giving to others. So, what does it mean for us? How does this idea of doing right by other people, how do we realize that? How do we act on that? What does it mean in real life? Any ideas? No one? Karen.
Well, I think you mentioned the verse about, like, if you know to do something that is right, like doing it instead of not doing it, which is really
Okay.
basic, but
Right, you would think it would be, but it isn't always. Anybody else have any ideas? Doing right by other people. A few things, just some simple, basic things I thought of. We're being honest, being fair, being patient, being kind, being present. I mean, sometimes people's hard times make it awkward for us or inconvenient for us, or we don't quite know how to act. But sometimes they just need somebody to stand with them or sit with them, to be present, to listen to people. How are we going to know what they need if we don't ever really listen? To have genuine concern for them, to put them first. I mean, a lot of these principles kind of layer on each other or kind of fit together to act in their best interest instead of our own. And that does not always mean agreeing with them or giving them what they want. Acting in their best interest might be, instead of giving them what they want, it might be not giving them something to help them grow. Acting in their best interest might be doing what will help them to grow spiritually or help them mature and develop their character in a godly way. I think that's especially true working with children and teenagers. Doing what is best for them is not always giving them what they want. In fact, often it's not giving them what they want. Doing what's best for them might be giving them restrictions or boundaries so they can learn character and learn some lessons that they need to learn. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, so this brings us to the end of this section, the end of chapter 2, and the end of this section about joy despite people. Or maybe it would be better to say it joy because of the people in our lives. I mean, Paul was joyful because of Timothy and because of Epaphroditus. So, for next week, review over the memory verses we've done so far. Philippians 1:12, Philippians 2:1 and 2, and then we'll start Philippians 3:13 next week. So next week will just kind of be a broad overview of Philippians chapter 3. So read through that chapter. If you have the book, read the text, pages 111 to 116. The next section of principles, the next 5, all relate to joy or having joy despite our past. Things that have happened in our past often have a tendency to affect our joy. And we need to learn how to change that, not let our past rob us of our joy. Any other comments or questions? Anyone? All right. Then we can finish up, since I'm sure you all have a ton of other things to do tonight. And Emily, if you want to go back, I did record and I made sure the microphone was on tonight. All right. Anything exciting happening this week?
Sounds good.
Emily's tackling a greenhouse tomorrow. Or Jordan is. Right? I don't think your mic is on.
Both. You don't tomorrow, Mom.
What? You don't need me tomorrow? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. All right. Well, we'll say good night
Okay.
Bye, Grandma.
and
Say kisses.
see you all next week.
You give kisses.
Bye, Asher.
Kisses. You give kisses to Grandma. Kisses. You know kisses. Say bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
You're gonna push the red button.
Bye.
Oh,
How
Emily, he was
quickly they
pointing to
learn
you.
that.
All right, buddy.
All right.
You can push
Goodbye.
it right there. Bye.
Bye.